Hello, I'm Nicholas Lorimer. I'm joined here today by Phila Shongwe. Phila, you are going to be joining the Daily Friend .co.za. We've got a group of podcasts. You're going to be joining us as a new show. What is your new show called?
Yeah, so I'll be joining with a show called Freedom Fanatics. So that's a show that was previously hosted under the Freedom Advocacy Network's banner, but now it's moved over to the Daily Friends banner. So I'll be joining the Daily Friend under or hosting a podcast titled Freedom Fanatics.
So before we get into exactly what your show is about, let's talk a little bit about who you are and why someone might want to listen to your show. So firstly, can you just talk about who you are and how you became interested in the world of political podcasting?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, my name is Phila Shongwe. As you've said, I was born in Ladysmith, KZN. Did all of my schooling in KZN, where I think a lot of my political awakening started. Obviously, a lot of the divide that we still see as a result of apartheid spatial planning was obviously around me as I was growing up, and I obviously questioned that, and I was very curious about why there seemed to be a very minute group of very wealthy individuals that stayed in very close proximity to people who are in ravaging poverty. So that really really concerned me, and I think well, obviously in high school I wasn't as politically awake as I was in university, as I suppose is the case with many South Africans and many college students around the world actually. It was only when I got to university though that I really started as it were, communicating some of my political thoughts. And that's when I obviously started doing a lot of research. I got into a lot of Marxian literature, a lot of Fanon literature, so from a racial perspective as well, because it did seem to me that a lot of these issues were predominantly racially orientated. So although I could clearly see what Marx was talking about, I could also see what Fanon was talking about. And so I became aligned with the EFF in my first year. But it was then that I started, involving myself in political discussions and a lot of debates in Stellenbosch. I went to Stellenbosch University. I didn't say that earlier. And it's a very, very ripe debating university. So we had a lot of discussions all the time, especially in my residence. And I very quickly made friends with people who obviously had opposing political viewpoints. And at the time, I, of course, thought that the reason they held those viewpoints was mainly because they had not experienced the kind of things that I had experienced and the kinds of things that my parents had experienced. Because obviously, growing up as a South African, you hear some, grueling stories, stories that people just won't believe if you told them. And so, I mean, that's what shaped me as an individual growing up. And when I got to university, I obviously wanted people to see it the way I did so desperately, but they didn't seem to do so. And I was obviously curious to find out why. And these debating sessions were obviously the perfect platform for me to find out. So I remained a Marxist throughout my first year and well into my second year. And it was then that I met Tian Alberts, who's a very, very good friend of mine now. I couldn't stand him in my first year, but yeah, he's a great friend of mine now. We started having discussions and he very slowly started changing my mind. He introduced me to Thomas Sowell. And the reason I mentioned Thomas Sowell is pretty interesting because when I look at my journey and Thomas Sowell's journey, they are very, very similar. So Thomas Sowell was born in North Carolina, United States, during the heights of the Great Depression in 1930 and during the heights of the Jim Crow system. So not only was there a lot of poverty in the United States, there was a lot of racial segregation as well, and so I took a liking to him naturally, just hearing his story, and I was obviously very interested in some of his views. I disagreed vehemently with a lot of them when I first heard them, but very very slowly he started seeping into my mind, as it were, and I started becoming more and more convinced, convinced of what he was talking about and convinced against what I had initially believed. And that's when I really started being interested in, as it were, trying to dispel some of the myths that a lot of people still hold about individualism, for example, about the free markets, for example. And it was then that I, joined Novo Mentis in Stellenbosch with my friends Tian and George. So we started a think tank and we started podcasting. And that's when I, also started podcasting, started chatting to some people, had very, very interesting conversations with, among other people, Professor Stan Duplessis, who's the COO of Stellenbosch University, who I can say very, very proudly changed my mind. He introduced me to Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky and Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which to this day remain two of the most consequential books I've ever read, because like most people, I had read, glimpses of Adam Smith's *The Wealth of Nations*, and was taken aback by the supposed individualism and selfishness that he seemed to profess in the Wealth of Nations. But I very quickly realized after reading The Theory of Moral Sentiments that was not who Adam Smith was at all. And I think a lot of people are still missing that missing link that really makes Adam Smith such a phenomenal thinker. I know this was a rather round and circuitous way of introducing myself, but I think it was important to say that so that, some South Africans who have a similar background and who have similar interests can know that, there are pieces of information out there that have not yet been explored, but that are hugely consequential.
It's really fascinating. It's always fascinating to see the story of someone who has gone from sort of essentially one side of the political aisle to another, and made that journey through reason and debate, which is always the way things should be done. So that's really interesting. And this podcast, Freedom Fanatics, what is it about, and what are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, so it's essentially a podcast that seeks to espouse a lot of the views that I personally hold. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, individualism, free markets, you can add non-racialism into that mix. But essentially it's about, liberal ideas. And I know the word liberal has been tainted nowadays by what many people see in the United States. So I'm definitely not that kind of liberal.
Unfortunately, it's become a very tortured term with a lot of abuse.
Unfortunately.
Not its original meaning.
Unfortunately. But yeah, I am, as it were, a liberal in the classic sense of the word. So yeah, I espouse traditional liberal ideas: free speech, individualism, non-racialism, free markets, etc. And I really want to try and have a conversation with people who are interested in a more academic conversation, but filtered down. So an evidence-driven conversation, very well researched, but delivered so that the ordinary person can obviously understand it. I often say when I talk to my friends that I'm envious of many, many talents. I'm envious of people who can sing really well. I'm envious of people who can dance really well. I'm envious of people who can act really well. But I'm most envious of people who speak really well. People who are able to relay what are otherwise very complex ideas to a lay audience, included in which are people like myself. And I obviously try to have those conversations with such people as well.
Awesome. So what platforms are we going to be able to find your new podcast on?
Sure. So on all the traditional social media platforms, we'll be there. We'll be on Ayano as well for audio podcasts for those who wish to listen to the podcast instead of seeing my face all the time. Although I won't know why they wouldn't want to do that, but I mean, it's their choice. But yeah, all the traditional social media platforms, you'll find us on YouTube. We'll be on Twitter. We'll be on Facebook. I'll occasionally post snippets of podcasts on LinkedIn. So for my LinkedIn connections, they can obviously hear that as well. But yeah, you will find us everywhere. It's a matter of time.
Fantastic stuff. Well, I look forward to seeing all of the great stuff you're going to produce. I believe you've already recorded a couple of episodes, and I'm sure you will be a very exciting and popular addition to the Daily Friend stable.
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much, Nick.